Hello and welcome to everyone joining us over Zoom and on Facebook Live. My name is Shubhanga Pandey. I'm the editor at Southasian based in Colombo. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all for another edition of Southasian Conversation, which is our series of online discussion where we bring interesting and important voices from across South Asia and the world. In the first edition of the series back in January, we looked at women politicians in South Asia, and you can find a recording of that on our website and on our social media pages. Today's South Asia conversation is on COVID-19 vaccination. And the plan is to think beyond the confines of medical science and public health and look at the, what the ongoing vaccination campaigns tell us about the existing social and economic structures of our societies. So we have a wonderful panel of speakers who bring a variety of regional and disciplinary experience and expertise. And the discussion will be moderated by Thomas Abraham. Thomas is currently an associate professor at the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong and is based in Bengaluru. He also has over 2 decades of experience as a journalist. He was the editor of the South China Morning Post and also a foreign correspondent for The Hindu. He's written extensively on epidemics and global health and is the author of 21st Century Plague, The Story of SARS, and most recently Polio, The Odyssey of Eradication. So before I hand it over to Thomas, just a few points. So we will be posting some useful infographics in our chat room and also on our Facebook page. So people on Facebook Live or Zoom, please check those to, it's useful infographics. I should also add that you can support Himal South Asian's independent non-nationalist journalism by becoming a member. You can do that by going to our website, himalmac.com, and along with a bunch of perks, you also get a copy of our famous right side up map delivered right to your home. So please do that. And over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Shubhanga. And welcome everyone to this discussion on a subject that obviously cannot be more timely. The world and our region are in the midst of a crisis that at the moment is destroying more human lives than any war that we have seen. And this is a region, as we all know, that has seen many wars and conflicts. Wars are perhaps more dramatic because there's physical destruction that you can see. And because they involve physical destruction, you see human beings fighting with each other and so on. But this is a war between man and microbe. So it seems a little less dramatic, but we just need to look around and think about what we're all experiencing to know that the human cost has perhaps been higher. It has been higher. We're here today to talk about the main shield that we have to protect ourselves and our societies against this virus, and that is vaccines. It is fair to say that in all our countries, the rollout of vaccines has been painfully slow. There are some exceptions. Bhutan, for example, has managed to provide a first dose to 60% of its population. Well, in the Maldives, it is 55%. But then once again, these are just first doses, and we need 2 doses for any meaningful kind of long-term immunity to kick in. In the rest of the region, the proportions are much, much lower. India, Nepal, maybe 7-8% for first doses, Sri Lanka a little lower, and so on. So this really is the issue that we need to confront. The role of vaccines in our regions, and the role that it can have, the role that it might have in moderating this pandemic. And to discuss this, we have an amazing panel from across the region. And I will introduce them shortly to talk, but let me just sort of set out the issues that perhaps it'd be nice to discuss. First of all, what lies behind these low figures? What do these figures tell us about our region's ability to protect itself from the biggest threat to our existence that we have faced in recent times? What do these low figures tell us about the world that we live in? And most important, how do we move forward? So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists in no particular order. We have Dway Banerjee, who is an associate professor of science, technology, and society at MIT in Boston. He is the author of a book, Enduring Cancer, which is an ethnography of cancer in India. And he's currently working on a history of art, physics, and computing in 1950s India. And he is a cultural anthropologist by training. Is that right? Is that right to say that? Okay, wonderful. Then we have Orzala Nemat, based in Kabul, and she is director of the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. And by training, she is a political ethnographer with a lot of experience in the area of development studies. She's also a research associate at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Then from Colombo, we have Ravindra Rananelia, who is a public health professional. He is executive director and fellow of the Institute of Health, based in Colombo. And it's really wonderful to have a public health person on a discussion or on a Zoom call, because most of the time, sort of the health or medical side is taken care of by clinicians. You've got cardiologists, you've got eminent doctors, and so on and so forth. But there is a huge difference between clinical medicine and public health. And so it'll be wonderful to have Ravindra's perspective on this. And last but certainly not least, we have Zaima Islam from Dhaka. She is a staff reporter at the Daily Star in Bangladesh. She focuses on rights-based investigation across a whole variety of subject areas. And during this pandemic, she has been reporting on labor rights, freedom of expression, preparedness of hospitals. So she, I guess, is our eyes and ears on the ground, away from, I guess, academic perspectives, but really giving us a ground level view of where we are. So before we begin, it'll be nice to really ground, because all of us are from different parts and from different, so if each one of us can give, if we could have some sort of perspective of where each one of our countries are, or your countries are, as far as vaccination is concerned, both in terms of figures, in terms of feeling, of getting anywhere. So perhaps I could begin with Zaima.
Yes, absolutely. So right now, our vaccination program is, we are giving second doses only. We're not giving first doses to anyone anymore, because we were getting vaccines from Serum Institute in India, and that stopped because of the US supply chain crisis. So for example, I'm waiting for my second dose. I got my first dose, I'm waiting for my second dose, but my dad, who was abroad, he can't get his first dose anymore. And he is someone who definitely needs it more than me. We've only vaccinated about, we've given first doses to about 3.6 million people. That's less than half the population of Dhaka itself. So Dhaka has about 8 million people. We are nowhere near vaccinating forget our entire population. We are not even vaccinating to the high-risk zones in Bangladesh. Sometime, I think a week back, we reported that 54 out of 65 districts in Bangladesh were basically being categorized as high-risk districts because of the infection rate. So things are not really looking up right now over here for us.
Ravi, can I turn to you next?
Yeah, Mr. Sri Lanka vaccination is a similar situation. We have just under 1 million doses. First doses given. There is a new supply that has come in, and they will announce will start second doses for the people who got the first doses. It's AstraZeneca. The reason for the reason for the very slow rollout has been that simply the country hasn't been able to access vaccines. The government had in fact purchased and paid for large amounts from the Serum Institute, but obviously for reasons everyone understands now, those doses are not coming anytime soon. And we've recently, it's been announced that they will be buying now doses from Pfizer and from Sputnik. So it looks like we're shifting to those. I also recommended that we should shift to Pfizer and Sputnik. So basically very slow rollout, basically because the government can't get hold of doses and it placed its orders, I think, far too late.
What are things like in Afghanistan in terms of the vaccination campaign? Do people want to get vaccinated?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel and have the discussion. In the case of Afghanistan, with the great and generous support of the Indian government, we received 1 million vaccination. Unfortunately, there aren't very accurate number of the people who have received the vaccination, but scatteredly speaking, in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, with higher concentration of population, there are centers where people can vaccinate themselves, but they are not crowded according to my resources. Occasionally, some people who still can trust the vaccination, they attend and they receive it. In terms of categorization, for some strange reason, Afghanistan did not follow the same rules that other countries did. For example, at the moment, I'm based in London, but I work fully on Afghanistan from here. I have not received my vaccination because here it's very strict and it's on age basis and on priority basis. In Afghanistan, I think one part that's probably followed this was the national security forces. They were offered the vaccination. There are no specific data whether it has been completed, like all of them are covered or not. With regards to the health centers, those who trust the vaccines, they do them. But I think there are two issues. One, there are no clear categorization in terms of prioritization of who should take it. So that needs to be specifically clarified. And secondly, I think there is a major trust issue with the vaccination, even within households, within families, within educated, let alone the uneducated who don't completely believe in it. So people are having serious concerns, especially a small news about a vaccination not working spreads so faster as opposed to a large news of look how many lives are saved. And campaigns are way too limited and restricted, maybe not even started the campaigns about awareness raising. Like it was only 2-3 days ago that my organization learned about facilities of vaccination being available. Whereas we know that vaccination has been available for weeks now in Kabul, that people can go and have access to it. So numbers, I think, are serious. We haven't been well in terms of reporting the numbers accurately, even in terms of positive cases. But one overall observation I can share is that, unfortunately, in the case of Afghanistan, it's violence, ongoing conflict happening parallel to the COVID spreading. And as we are heading towards the wave 3, as we call it, it's going to be extremely challenging because, for example, in insecure areas, it will be very difficult to even imagine that people will have access to vaccination or any form of treatment.
It's we'll be getting a whole bunch of issues that we can sort of unpack as we move on. But Dway, would you like to talk about, you, as a good global citizen, you've got a choice of at least 2 places that you can talk about, India, as well as your current physical location, and maybe draw a contrast between them.
No, absolutely. I'd say that I work more on India, but physically I'm located here. So I've managed to get both my doses. What's interesting to me here is that there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy unevenly divided across the country, but there is a fair amount. For example, there's a motion in California to recall the congressperson because he's been too forceful about enforcing the vaccine. So at the same time, the rates of vaccination are fairly high. So in Massachusetts, where I live, we're at about 55% for the first dose and about 35% for the second for people who got both doses. So I'm interested also to hear more about how much hesitancy actually prevents people from getting it when it comes to the when it becomes available. Because I think as an anthropologist, notice people are able to hold two ideas at the same time, but they even if they're hesitant, they do sometimes go ahead with the vaccine. With India, as you all well know, it's uneven again. The rates are between 4 to 11%. The numbers are difficult to gauge, but it's we're looking at much lower rates of vaccination than we should have been able to roll out by this point. So at this rate, we're looking at maybe May 2022 as a time where vaccines will be anywhere close to the WHO guideline of 60% for herd immunity. So the question also for me is, what do we do in this long meantime where it's not going to be anytime soon that we're going to have vaccinations to the extent that it'll be strong enough. It'll be strong enough to stop the spread. So, what do we do in the next few months, where we're seeing this unprecedented crisis in Delhi and in other cities and other states where similar crises are going on, but because of the unevenness of data reporting, we don't know what is actually happening in other states.
That's wonderful. And then actually got a really interesting point that we're going to come to later. Is what do we do? We've given these low, as we move forward, what does the future hold for us? And do we have any alternatives? But before that, there are a number of interesting things. Clearly, vaccine hesitancy based on low trust. The issues of prioritization, because I've seen different forms of prioritization. In Bangladesh, Saima, you've already got both your shots, I understand. In other places, you've got one shot already. In other places, it's, they have different categories of prioritization. And really, what does these different priority, when governments set different priority lists, what does it tell us about the governments themselves? And of course, we've got the whole issue of a shortage of supply, which is a common thing. And why in the year 2021, right? Are some parts of the world so short of supply, while other parts, have vaccinated significant proportions and have actually bought more than enough or ordered 3 times their population, vaccine supply. So that's another thing that these are 3 of 4 of the broad issues that I'd like to, that I hope we can unpack if all of you are okay with that. Perhaps we should begin with the issue of trust, because that is something that, as it's come across repeatedly. So perhaps I should, Ravi, as the public health person, perhaps the person most directly involved in immunization campaigns or with most experience, maybe I start with you on this. What is the reason in the midst of a raging pandemic, why is there such low trust in vaccines?
Sure. So just to say one thing about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, historically, we've not had a vaccine hesitancy problem, and we have 99% coverage with most vaccines. So Sri Lanka is relatively unusual. But I think, and the United States, I think, is at the other spectrum of this. So it's a social difference. But I think right now, a couple of things. I think I'm not too worried at the moment about vaccine hesitancy for us. Because, frankly, as I said, Sri Lanka only has enough vaccines for 4%, 5%, one dose. It doesn't really matter. Just give it to whoever's going to take it at this point. Secondly, I think we do know, and this is from the United States, we know this, and I think the UK, once vaccines are given in bulk, we can see in the polling data that people's receptivity to the vaccine will change. So I think, I'm not losing sleep over hesitancy at this point. I think it will get better, but since we don't have enough vaccines, it's sort of a hypothetical hypothetical academic question. Now, why is this potentially worse for this vaccine? I think, it's not surprising. I don't know, there must be infinitely more social media and media discussion about COVID than any other infectious disease that we've ever discussed in the past in our lifetime. So it's inevitable that people have views about this. Also, I think the fact that, all these vaccines have been approved on an emergency use basis. They have not, and for reasons of necessity, lives are at stake. We've rushed these things through. And so there is, of course, there is some grounds for people to have concerns. Now, of course, I'll tell you as a public health person, having a jab is better than having no jab, right? So even if it's a dangerous one. So I think that's clear. But because of that, I think the whole process, we will face more concerns from people about the risks. And, it's legitimate. And I think we just have to deal with that. And I think two things I would say. I think we have to be very transparent about when we make decisions. And sometimes, I know in Sri Lanka, some of the things they said about vaccines are not transparent. People try to sugarcoat things without being completely honest. And then with COVID, it always catches up to you a few months later. So I think we really have to be careful about what we say and stick to the facts and be honest about the limitations. So I think that's what I would say. And I think you will get, right now I'm not worrying about it. This is a vaccine hesitancy is a problem of affluence, right? It's a problem for the United States. It's not a problem of scarcity, right? And the real problem is the scarcity in our region. And I will point out one thing. This is a South Asian discussion, right? So remember, we are also incredibly fortunate. If you go to Africa, almost zero, it's basically zero people have got the vaccine. And they have had, in many ways, just as bad a pandemic. And we are completely forgetting about them. And I think Western countries forget about them because, frankly, Asia is the place where they play their, where geopolitical tension is highest. But actually, the reality is things are even worse in Africa, and things are pretty bad in Latin America.
Okay, so I think that it's another really interesting sort of stream that you have introduced into the discussion, and that is the fact that in our region, it's not so much vaccine hesitancy, but scarcity that is the issue. Hesitancy might be an issue later. We don't know once we have ample stocks of vaccine, if and when we do. But right now, the issue is scarcity. But you also spoke, and I'd really about the effect of social media, about the fact that it's emergency use, and people don't quite understand perhaps what these things mean. And clearly, people are not that happy about this. They're not completely convinced. And you spoke about transparency, lack of transparency. So, Saima, I'd like to come to you, since you're really perhaps more on the ground than anybody else in terms of what are people thinking about vaccines? Why are they not? I mean, if you had plentiful vaccines in Bangladesh, would people be happily lining up?
No.
Or are they worried about? So tell me, what are people worried about?
So if you, for example, go to any vaccination center across the city, the one thing that you'll probably notice is that the only people taking vaccines do belong to a more affluent class. You would see these like ramshackle, run-down public hospitals hosting vaccination centers with beautiful plush leather couches for the vaccine receivers to rest on. It's really striking. I do think that the hesitancy is something that we're not necessarily concerned with it right now because we don't have enough vaccines. But the segregation is real. A certain class of people are getting vaccines first. And then there were a couple of, when the vaccines first came, there were a couple of categories that were prioritized. Of them, for example, bureaucrats, civil servants were prioritized. Frontline workers were prioritized, educators were prioritized, journalists. So people belonging to, professions. So people, for example, belonging to a lower socioeconomic class, they were not prioritized. They were not priority when it came to receiving vaccines. Although they're probably the ones with the lowest levels of immunity, because they're probably the ones with lower levels of nutrition. And we don't even know how many of them have been affected by COVID-19, because if you, for example, go to slums or like highly dense lower socioeconomic areas, you won't find people talking about COVID-19 at all. They don't have access to masks. They don't have access to sanitation services as much as some of us perhaps, but you won't find them actually talking about COVID-19 because for them being infected is a death sentence. It would mean that they would have to quarantine themselves for 14 days. And for example, if you're a daily wage earner, you're not going to want to quarantine yourself for 14 days. You cannot afford to stay home. What are you going to eat? How are you going to feed your family? You're not going to. So in the slums, and then this is something that caseworkers have been talking to us about, is that when they try to go and raise awareness about COVID-19 last year, they received such vicious, vehement backlash from the residents of different slum areas because they did not want to talk about COVID-19 at all. And even when, we're in the middle of a lockdown right now, supposedly, but the daily wage earners, people who work blue collar jobs, garments workers, they're still out and about. They're still going to work. I mean, so am I, but they're going to work, and they're the ones who probably needed vaccines first. But yeah, well, here we are.
This is an issue that I think all of us are familiar with, and that is really the contradiction between, I mean, do you die of the virus or do you die of starvation? And that really is, I think, the dilemma that people all across face. And I think our whole discussion on vaccines also needs to be in this larger context. This is not a context that you have in the West, where you don't have a choice between, you don't have to make this choice between protecting yourself and being able to eat the next day. So I think this is another thing that perhaps we'd like to come back and also throw to the audience. Also, I'd like to turn to you now, because in addition to the issues that we've talked about already, Afghanistan has got this very special and very tragic situation of basically you're in armed conflict, So you've got a virus, you've got a vaccine, you've got a deeply divided society, plus you've got all of these other problems that we've been talking about in other countries, perhaps lack of trust, lack of access, lack of supply, people are unable to protect themselves, perhaps, lack of basic masks, I don't know. But could you unpack some of these issues for us?
Thank you. I'm listening to Zaima speaking from Bangladesh. I think we all share a lot of similarities in these cases. I think in terms of research and analysis, it probably is a time to go back and also draw some observations on how, for example, lockdown worked in our part of the world. For example, in Afghanistan, lockdowns were taken serious, by the way. When I talked to my colleagues last March, they say, yeah, there were like only a few weeks, where you could see people were like wearing gloves and masks and just completely covering themselves. You could see that suddenly the overcrowded cities and the streets became like ghost places, but only for a few weeks until people figured out what was going on. And slowly everyone was back, and particularly for daily laborers, for small and medium enterprises, this was something that they couldn't afford. We've seen a huge impact on even middle class, lower middle class community, not the poor of the poorest, because they anyway didn't have much to lose, but it was people who could manage somehow their life with the incomes coming daily on weekly basis, and they lost it completely in that period. And soon after, the people got into the state of denial. Politicians also got into the state of denial because of the sort of the high speed of the political processes happening. Politicians need rallies. I'm sure this is also shared in other parts of the South Asia. I've seen the Indian rallies. So for rallies, you need masses. And I think if we can look into this global pandemic and have some sort of a court of justice at the international level, we have to bring these people to prosecution, because they deliberately put people at risk, bringing them together. And this time, where we know the threats of virus is not different from the threat of war, it takes lives, and that's what matters. War takes life, COVID takes lives. So that is there. if we compare the hesitancy versus the availability of vaccination, I think I go with the fact that definitely if the vaccines are available and people make choices not to take them, it's a different conversation. But at the moment, the issue, and probably I was earlier mentioning about the campaigns and somehow hesitancy towards raising too much awareness on the vaccination is probably the fear of government saying that, oh, what if we give people the means to trust vaccines and then not give them vaccines? Then what? So there will be more blaming towards the government, and I see in terms of unequal distribution of this, and I see there is a lot of sort of international power rivalry also coming into play when we talk about the vaccinations. Earlier, I heard someone mentioned about some countries having more than what they need, and some countries have not enough. There are people from our family, from our relatives who live in different parts of, for example, Europe, and some have received two. Younger people have received two shots, two doses, but the elderly who are more sort of vulnerable have not received their first. So that kind of inequality in the world has also reflected very clearly in the case of COVID-19. And earlier I mentioned about the sort of security and conflict. We are in the armed conflict, and as we speak, the operations is ongoing, unfortunately. The unfortunate reality in terms of linkages between conflict and COVID is that, unfortunately, from the very beginning of it up until now, as we speak, for none of the parties to conflict, this became a serious matter. Yes, they have raised issues. For example, the Taliban said, oh, for a period of time, they delayed a few weeks their meetings in Doha earlier last year by saying, oh, many of our members have been infected by COVID. But that was it. As soon as they recovered, I'm not sure what is the situation in Doha, but probably their top leaderships are already vaccinated with 2 dosages. It's the masses back home, the foot soldiers, the ordinary ground forces that have no access to vaccination, and whether they are the Taliban soldiers or the Afghan National Security Forces or the ordinary civilians, the vaccination is not available. And even if it becomes available, I believe countries like us would require further additional management systems to really properly distribute it, to ensure that there is humanitarian access to all parts where we can sort of try to reach to maximum of the population.
Thank you. Actually, this is really, many of you have said the same thing. So I'm going to look at a couple of common themes. One, I think, before we talk about hesitancy, let's look at supplies, right? Because without supplies, and Ravi, I think you put that really very eloquently, there's no point, let's get to supplies first, and then we talk about hesitancy. And then Ursula, you also talked about, and Saima as well, in terms of, we live in countries that are characterized by scarcity, right? Scarce public health infrastructure. Even if you do have people to actually, and this is not like polio where anyone, you can, but you really need trained health. You have the health infrastructure to do this. Saima, you talked about, the dilemma of the textile workers, for example, or any daily wage workers on what they need to do. So, Dway, can I come back to you to start kicking off some of these balls, in particularly the issue of scarcity within a global context. And the fact that as we all know, there are 3 or 4 vaccine manufacturing hubs globally, and while the demand is universal. So in a sense, what does this tell us about the world? What does the way that vaccines are divided tell us about the so-called globalized 21st century world that we live in?
That's a great question. And as I think Saima and Ursula brought up, there are countries which have several times the number of doses that they need, at least on order, if not actually at hand. Canada is an extreme interesting example because it's perhaps the one which has the most on paper. It has 10 times almost the number of doses it needs, except I have friends in Canada who are not getting it because the pre-orders didn't seem to be the right ones, and so it's not actually what it sounds like. But the general question is very much this, that Western Europe, most countries have 3 to 4 times what they, on order at least, 3 to 4 times of what they need. And we're forgetting often Africa in this discussion, where there is almost no hope of getting any sort of supply until the end of 2022, if this is what goes on. So we have a situation where the top few countries have monopolized 85% of the doses that of what might be available in the next few months. So what has been done to address this problem, and where is India's place in this, is an interesting question for me, because as we know, there was this moment during the HIV/AIDS crisis where CIPLA and Indian manufacturers really stepped up, and MSF was distributing at one point of time Indian antiviral therapies that were for the in Africa, that were for most part 90% were from being produced in India. So I think there's a really interesting comparison between then and now, because then there was a real political will to make sure that regardless of patent rights, regardless of international US pressure, countries still went ahead and enforced compulsory licenses and so on. This time around, there hasn't been the same sort of political will. And the way in which global distribution is happening is not necessarily based on need as much as it's based on people being able to buy it. So India is exporting it, but not in the last way where they were mostly exporting it to places where needed it, but they're exporting it to people who will buy it. They're also not, yeah. So it's a very different epidemic now than the one that we have in recent memory. Yeah, so it would be interesting to come back to the question of where's India's place, and a very changed place in the role of actually not being a source of scarcity, but a place where production was at one point of time crucial to public health across the world.
I'll come to you in a minute. But before that, Saima, there's one thing I wanted to ask you about. I think the big question that we need to address is why are there so few people, or so few centers of vaccine manufacture globally? Because the technology is not, you get vaccines across a variety of technologies, right? And it's not rocket science. We have enough trained manpower in the region to be able to do this. The economics perhaps may not work. But Saima, I know that Bangladesh there is a company in Bangladesh that is working on a vaccine. And I believe clinical trials have already begun. Now, I just saw a small reference to this in a news item somewhere, but very little about who is doing this, what stage they're at, what kind of vaccine, and really what their aim is. Is it, do they see them as a new manufacturing hub in South Asia? So I wonder, do you have anything on this?
So I don't think I can speak at length about this, but I do know what you're talking about. So what you're talking about is vaccine that's being produced. They finished clinical trials for that. The organization that you're talking about is ICDDRB, the International Center for Diarrheal Diseases Research, Bangladesh. They've worked on vaccines in the past. They've worked on the cholera vaccine. They've almost entirely eradicated cholera in Bangladesh. They are still right now. When it comes to vaccines, they really are the premier organization. So they finished clinical trials, but they're still waiting for approval for actual human trials to begin. And they're doing this in conjunction with Bharat Biotech. And unfortunately, since the actual trials have not happened, this is not something that we are going to production for anytime soon. We have also just started, and this happened today. The government is now going to go for co-production for Sinopharm and Sputnik. So Sinopharm is the vaccine from China, and Sputnik is the vaccine from Russia. So and the government has allowed it as an emergency use measure. So we don't know any more details about that as of yet because it's still very, very much developing. In fact, it literally just broke a couple of hours before this webinar. So we're still, I think this is a developing story, and we need to figure out who is actually going to be producing this vaccine. We do have a very thriving pharmaceutical sector. That is something we can definitely talk about, but I'm not sure who's going to be producing it.
It's really interesting. And the other thing, of course, is that if we look at from the context of global politics, you've got Western sources of vaccine based in Europe, but you've also got Russia and you've got China, and you had India. You will have India again. So you're seeing a multipolar, and you also are seeing real competition between them, right? Everybody is waiting for somebody else to move out, and saying, okay, if the West is not, if India cannot give you vaccines, or if the US cannot give you, we've got this excellent vaccine, don't worry, we'll manufacture it there, and so on and so forth. So Ravi, I want to come to you on this because I know you've got strong ideas and you've thought this through as well. Two issues really. One is in terms of public health, Sri Lanka, but from the time of independence or even before, has been a leader in public health and childhood immunization. I mean, the rates have been sort of developed country rates for several decades now, I think. Plus, in terms of manufacturing, the sort of scientific manpower, I don't think there's any shortage either. So why is Sri Lanka facing a shortage of vaccines? That's question number one. And number two, how do you see this sort of playing out in the larger global context?
Okay, so let me deal with this Sri Lankan situation. I mean, yes, we do have very high vaccine coverage, but the key thing to note is that it's partly, I mean, we have also very good access to medicines, but it's basically because we've chosen to import. We go for the cheapest producer for most things, and India is our producer, basically, for most things. And so we have, ridden on the Indian industrial pharmaceutical industry success of the past 30, 40 years, and we simply basically import most of our drugs. Now, there is some local production increasingly going on, but we have separated importing and production from the issue of access. So in this particular case, we don't actually have any real vaccine production capacity. So although we produce some drugs, we basically import APIs, from China or from wherever, and we package them like India does. We don't actually have any vaccine production going on. So this is not something that I think we could jump to, unlike, say, maybe India or Bangladesh. So that I think is, the short answer. Now, why did we not? The real other question is why we didn't order vaccines early enough. I mean, we're not the poorest country in the region, right? I think Maldives is richer than us in South Asia. And the reason for that is I think there was a lot of complacency. Last year we did relatively well, and then I think people, which is again related to the overall COVID response, they haven't fully understood what was required on the vaccination front. And maybe I should just spell it out. I mean, COVAX is giving us 20%. In theory, who knows when you'll get it, but you'll get it at some point, 27%. That is simply not going to cut in terms of getting herd immunity. And then this mantra, which I think WHO and most experts said a year ago when they had to guess a number, they said 60, 65% herd immunity coverage. That number's not true, right? I mean, we know better now, right? I mean, the fact is, if you want herd immunity with, let's say, most of the vaccines, you need 75 to 90% coverage under normal circumstances for COVID. So that's number one. The second problem is these new variants. They've completely upset the apple cart, right? I mean, with B117, and the recent news in the past week from Sri Lanka is it's basically we realized we now have a B117 epidemic, right? So this is where, like the UK, fortunately, we don't have the Indian variant, which is even worse. But the problem with B117 is you cannot get herd immunity with AstraZeneca or with Sinopharm or with Sinovac. You need 90% efficacy vaccines. There's only really 3 of them. There's basically Pfizer, Moderna. Pfizer is available for a few rich countries. Moderna is basically not available to anyone outside the United States, and that leaves only Sputnik. And Sputnik doesn't have the production capacity and the know-how. So this is the problem we face, right? So, and I think the Sri Lankans didn't quite realize this, and it's only now when the Indian supply vanished that we have placed the orders for Pfizer and Sputnik out of, I think, desperation. And I think it still hasn't completely sunk in that we need very high levels of coverage. So the president last week said, vaccination is going to be, the final solution to the problem. I don't know what they told him, because we haven't ordered enough doses to get herd immunity, even with Pfizer. So I think this is a political level problem, and I think also related to bad advice internationally and also locally. So that's Sri Lanka's problem. Global problem. I think there's a good and a bad to this. We need to be honest that, in one sense, there's been an incredible achievement, right, to produce the vaccines we've got. Normally countries vaccinate kids, when they're 18 months, or, everyone gets 1 or 2 shots of this and that vaccine. We vaccinate 2-3% of the world every year, 4 or 5% maybe, if we count all the different doses. We're suddenly asking the world to produce 80-90% of the world in 12-24 months. We're talking about a tenfold increase in production. That cannot be done by any single country or any single economic bloc. And it's not just a question of, Bangladesh can set up a factory, they have the expertise, there are all these supply inputs. In India, Serum Institute couldn't produce because it couldn't get plastic bags from America, right? So the supply chain cannot provide the inputs. People talk about relaxing patents on mRNA vaccines. The key inputs into the mRNA vaccines by Pfizer are incredibly short supply, right? So it's not as if, we have the technology, we can do this. The supply chain is really messed up. Now, in order for us to have solved this problem, we would have had to cooperate globally on vaccine production. And the tragedy for us, and this is the bad, is that this pandemic happened, started at the end of the Trump administration, but it happened at the beginning of the new Cold War. And this isn't Trump, this is a trend which has been going on in the West, particularly in the United States, for many years, but it predates Trump. We entered into an era where the United States, I think, primarily recognizes that its number one position is under long-term threat. As Biden said to Congress recently, they will do whatever they can to stay in that position. And that's the context. So this has made global cooperation incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The last time we did global vaccines for everyone to kill a virus, and the public health people know this, was smallpox. Smallpox happened because the United States had enough leadership and vision and humanity to recognize smallpox affects us all. The Soviets have the vaccine technology and the production facilities, and we will give them greenbacks to pay for that, and we can distribute that to the world, to India or whoever else, right? And a lot of the Indian vaccine production capacity dates from the smallpox era. That's not happened this time, right? The United States, some of the producers in China and Russia are under sanctions. If you look at PCR testing, which is another critical constraint, the biggest PCR manufacturer in the world is in China. It's under sanctions from the United States in the middle of a pandemic. And the supply chains are messed up. They won't even give stuff to Europe, as you know, or to India. They're doing a little bit for India now. But this failure to cooperate is really sunk us. And I really don't see how we get the huge quantities of good vaccines we need quickly enough unless the world cooperates. And that really ultimately means Washington has to change its strategy. I would note the Europeans are generally open to cooperation. The Chinese and Russians have said they're open to cooperate. They've asked for cooperation, but it's Washington. I don't know how we get Washington to understand that its geopolitical strategy vis-a-vis China cannot override the need of humanity. We have to cooperate. China has significant vaccine capacity, and I think for the next few months, because India's problems that it's facing, the only spare capacity in the world right now is going to be in China. And the Chinese don't need to vaccinate. If we could tell China, guys, don't vaccinate your population. Protect, keep your borders secure. Please don't vaccinate yourselves. Please give your vaccine production, and we'll help you produce more. We'll help them get them approved. And also, the Russians don't have production capacity. They need to work with the Europeans and Indians. I think we need to be helping them.
Thank you, Ravi. Dway, I think you wanted to come in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that the issue of production is not a technical one as much as it's a political one. So, why does India have the production capability it does in the first place? In the 1970s, we did not have any any pharmaceutical production capacity at all. It was very much one or two legal changes by a government that wanted to change the colonial picture that within 10 years doubled, tripled, then exponentially created a pharmaceutical industry that did not exist. So the fact that there was production at a certain time was a political outcome. Now I think I was right that it's a Cold War geopolitics, but I think the issue is deeper than that. I think the significant and central issue is a capture of the US government by the pharmaceutical lobby. So it isn't even necessarily in the US government's interest to not play a larger role in the global stage. In different ways, it can work to its advantage. What is really holding them back is the fact that pharmaceutical, the major 4 or 5 corporations have made sure that the patent rights trump the lives of people. And that is in the middle of a pandemic and in a completely unconscionable situation where the reason that we cannot produce some of these vaccines is not because India doesn't have the ability to produce a Moderna or a Pfizer, it's because the companies have held on to these technical expertise and will never allow it to be distributed across the world. So it's a very specific, you can point it very specifically down to 4 corporations and their lobby pressure in the US government that we have the inequality of distribution that we do now. And the last thing, a very telling case in this is the AstraZeneca vaccine, where you saw that it was being it was produced very much within a public institution, the Oxford Labs, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put so much pressure on the university that they ended up licensing it to only one manufacturer, AstraZeneca. And there was a possibility then of having a different idea of what access to AstraZeneca would mean, which would mean actual knowledge, actual access to the knowledge of production, technology transfer, if you will, not just a license. And that was shut down. And that was shut down by a big global public health foundation. And we should ask why, whose interest is that in to deny technical knowledge of production to most of the world?
Thanks very much. So, I want to move to Saima or Zala, do you want to come in on this particular discussion? Otherwise, here's what I would like to do. Probably got another 5-10 minutes we can talk among ourselves before we throw it open. Now, I think we've set these problems out, and especially looking at the globe, whether it's conflict, whether it's the global structures that we have, that we live in, that we're sort of frozen into. The question now is, what can we do about this, right? What are some of the things that, as a region, because one should never be helpless. You can always blame other people for your problems, but your problems are not going to go away. Ultimately, unless you do something yourself, only you can solve your own problems. So what do you think? And just thinking off the top of your head, I mean, do you sort of see some sort of a South Asian pan-regional public health infrastructure, not just for vaccines, but for future preparedness for communicable, non-communicable disease, pandemic preparedness? Is this something that can happen? I think it's something that should happen. If it cannot happen, or is this just being idealistic? Are we sort of so frozen in the existing global structures that nothing's ever going to happen? So I want to throw it to let me start with you, Zaima. I mean, from your perspective in Bangladesh, which is also geostrategically in as important a location as Afghanistan is, one is on the east and the other is on the west. Bangladesh is also deeply committed to, I mean, in terms of SARC, it's been one of the sort of countries that sort of has been pushed this. What do you think? I mean, do you see any possibility, or what are the possibilities for breaking out of these structures, for doing some sort of regional thing? And we talk about Bharat Biotech and so on, but how can we create solutions now within working as a region, as more than 1/3 of the world's population, right?
In fact, just yesterday, the foreign ministers of 6 nations, there was China, and then there were 5 South Asian countries, which included Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh. They issued a joint statement saying that vaccine nationalism cannot be a thing. And this is such a rare occurrence where 6 foreign ministers of this region actually put out a statement like this. This is honestly a cry for help, and this is something. And I understand that there is willingness, of course, to work together. I'm just not sure that, especially since so much of this is beyond the control of just this region, I'm not sure the solution is something that we can envision at this moment. But they are definitely coming together. That's all I can say right now.
Ozela.
Thank you. In terms of what needs to be done, listening to excellent points that Ravi has made in Dway as well, I think definitely we are in a situation that the global power relations is affecting also the same way other forms of inequality is affecting us. Here also it's a reflection of that sort of inequality showing itself. So it's very clear, and I'm pleased that Zaima brought up the statement yesterday. I was going to mention that. In fact, is very important at this time to have a stronger solidarity. And the region, the SAARC countries, or the South Asia region, is one of the regions that has very particular characteristics as opposed to many other regions. Say, for example, Africa. It's shocking to hear that they have zero access to vaccination, but that also is probably a reflection of their importance in terms of, emerging economies. They are not at the moment an emerging economy. They are a recipient of investment from emerging economies, and that's why they become completely, as a continent, completely forgotten. So we do have these incredible strengths that we can use it in terms of lobbying and putting some level of pressure. So if from small countries like Afghanistan to larger countries like India, and I don't know where Indonesia and the broader Asian region or Southeast Asia are laying in that. But I think what I can see very concretely as practical steps that we can take is at least to first come up with this kind of conversations where we can map what's happening. I'm learning a lot from this conversation today in terms of, the effectiveness of different vaccination and the degree of their effectiveness. Back home, when people talk about AstraZeneca, they highlight some side effects that are being rumored, that these are the side effects and so forth, but not the efficacy of the vaccination, which is a case. So we are also one thing we can do is to keep more regular awareness of our population, particularly I think through the professional channels and people who are having the qualification to speak, so that we avoid all kind of conspiracies and all other things that are also probably part of the market strategies by certain, companies in competition. Another thing we can do is not to only limit this to a kind of a vaccine diplomacy, as it is called in the foreign relations, subject, but, build that bridge between the foreign relations or IR diplomacy of vaccination and the actual medical needs that are there. I think that bridge is not really significant at the moment, and for different reasons, starting from the United States last year up to many other parts of the world. I think that also really contributed significantly in creating a more chaos rather than managing this pandemic better than we were expecting. And thirdly, something that at least I am happy to say that ARU, Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, is part of, are these consortiums. We are part of a broader consortium led by an Institute of Development Studies, IDS, in the UK, where organizations from India, from different South Asian regions, and also from countries in Africa, I believe, and several other parts, are members of this consortium doing a more systematic research, not necessarily on the vaccination, but overall on the impacts of COVID-19. I think research and continuous studies is a way of, pushing more for evidence-based type of advocacy that we need to do. So there are these are some sort of thinking in my head to share with you all, but I'm definitely emphasizing more on the importance of continuing this conversation, and particularly bringing in the US, China, Russia, all these major countries together and make this conversation two-sided, that they also can represent and can be face-to-face with professionals from the South Asian region or broader region to have these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. Before I kick the ball to you, Ravi, there's one thing I would like to caution against, and that is the notion that Africa has no access to vaccines. They're not a helpless basket case. Both funding from the African Development Bank, the African Union has raised huge amounts of money, some from philanthropies, local philanthropies. I mean, there are rich people in Africa as well. So in fact, countries, Malawi was one of the first countries to get access to the Pfizer vaccine, and because they could afford it. So in a sense, I think we all have the same potential, we have the same capabilities, we have the same structures, we have the same access to funding, we are in a sense constrained by the same global system, but none of us are helpless. And so I think it's just something, because I've been looking at African access to vaccines, I've been studying for a while. And to be honest, 3-4 months ago when I started looking into it, I was also surprised by the extent of what they've done. But anyway, that's by the by. Ravi, let me pull you into this now.
It's just some observations on all this. I'm all in favor of relaxing the patents and trying to, not allow 4 companies to dominate everything. I think that Dway was raising, but I think that's a very simplistic. I think it's a view that comes from having a lot of vaccines in the West, right? It's a view of affluence, and I certainly recognize, for example, the Biden administration has many people in the administration who are Pfizer shareholders, right? It's been reported to science that Pfizer has $5 million or something of stock, but I don't think that's what's driving it. I mean, let's be completely frank about this, right? Second, even if we could give these technologies, let's be honest, even where they had the vaccine patents and they were starting production, these big manufacturers have had huge problems. Even serum, this problem didn't just happen because of supply input problems from America. It was happening earlier. They've had problems scaling up, right? This is to produce the amount of vaccines we need in the quantity we need at the speed we need. It's like going to the moon. We need a superhuman effort to do it, but it has to be a global moon shot, not an American moon shot. And I think we need to be realistic about this. Now, the other thing I would just say is we are running a race against time, right? Because the more this virus spreads, and let's be honest, for all the hoopla about vaccines, as WHO has reported, the case count in the last week is the highest it's ever been in the pandemic. Things are not getting better. And the more the virus spreads, the more of these variants we're getting, some of which will undermine the existing vaccines, right? And, rich countries are preparing. They're already buying. The United States has already bought a 3rd Pfizer shot they announced. They are preparing for that, whilst the rest of the world don't even have their first shot. So if we're going to solve this problem, we need to vaccinate the whole world very rapidly to stop these variants evolving, right? And so this is not simply a question of money. And that primarily for me, it's a production problem which requires global public action. And why do I say public action? The United States got one thing right? They got the vaccine production right? And why did they get it right? It wasn't the free market. I mean, Dway said, these 4 private companies, yeah, they're making lots of money, but we didn't get there because the market worked. We got there because the United States put its hand in its wartime toolbox, the Defense Production Act, which is its wartime production powers. It's based on the Korean War, but it goes back to the Second World War when they used central planning to defeat Nazism, right? And so what does that act allow them to do? They can issue contracts without bidding. They can order companies to produce stuff by fiat. They can set prices. Companies have no recourse to the courts on this, right? They need an intensive state action. So we need to learn from the leading capitalist economy, that we need state action, but we need it globally. So the Chinese have not really done this. The Europeans definitely have not done this. We need concerted government state action across the world to fix the supply chains and get the production. So I think we need to be a bit more realistic about this. And we need to do this very rapidly, because otherwise, we are facing another 2 or 3 years of difficulties. Maybe the only optimistic thing we can say is the rich countries will protect themselves and wall themselves off from the rest of us, and they'll be okay. But for people in South Asia, we can't. And I think we really need to step up and address this. Now, what can we do as a region? There is increasing agency, seems to me, for, it used to be called the third world, but the world, the developing world, which does not belong to the power blocks. I think we have to step up and make our voice heard. And that's good to hear that, the Prime Minister, as I had said, the Minister said region recently, that we need action on this at the global level. And I think it has to be done maybe through the UN or the G20. It cannot be done. I read some editorial in an American journal saying the G7 should act. Well, that simply misses the point. G7 is the Western countries. We need G20 or UN Security Council action to put in place a global solution. This is if we want to solve this. Otherwise, I think we can improve things at the margin, but we face a very long slog.
Okay, thank you. A lot of food for thought you give. Now I notice, Shubhanga, can I throw this open, because we've got a lot of questions coming in.
Can I possibly respond to Ravi's comments just now for just a quick second?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The problem isn't necessarily just patent rights, because production is globally tiered in particular ways. At the same time, I think what some of the problems with the global distribution aspect is that the mechanisms for distribution are also being captured by US and pharmaceutical interests. So we do have global fora for vaccine production and distribution, which is two big ones. The main one is COVAX initiative that many countries, 180 countries have bought into, including the US now. But it won't work. It won't work for the simple reason that it requires, it's purely voluntary on the part of the rich countries. They can sign as many bilateral deals as they want. COVAX will not produce anything close to what is required. And it's almost a front, I would say, by the richer countries to say that there is this, we are doing all this global coordination, but it's not the right answer. It's definitely the wrong answer. We have, and we're not helpless, because we have tools at our disposal that have been legally used before, and one of them is compulsory licensing of a certain kind. That's one of the ways that the Nelson Mandela government put pressure on the US. And the one question that has been raised with compulsory licenses is that it doesn't always entail a technology transfer. That doesn't have to be the way. Compulsory licenses can enact very strong restrictions and enforce contracts upon global corporations. At the same time, what are we doing and not showing helplessness in these global forums in WTO and the UN? We're asking for a very specific thing, which is a waiver of the TRIPS protocol. Now, I'm all in favor of waiver of the TRIPS protocol, which would mean every country would be able to produce and sell, and etc. The problem is, again, it will never happen, because the WTO works on a consensus-based model where every country has to agree. We're never going to get more than half to. So what is India and other global South countries doing by pushing the TRIPS waiver agreement? I think they should trying a moonshot that is bound to fail, and ignoring real possible, already on the cards, tried and tested approaches like compulsory licensing to enforce a different model of distribution, and not COVAX or CTAP and these other models that have been proposed by the US.
And the WTO. We've got two Really interesting viewpoints on this. I don't think we're going to resolve this. And Shubhanga, can I throw this over? There are a lot of questions on the chat, and you've probably got stuff coming in on the on Facebook. I don't know. I haven't been monitoring it. So can we throw this open now to our wonderful audience? Okay, this is actually, this is something, and I'm going to, Ravi, I'm going to throw this to you as our only EPI public health person. How much worry is there around this becoming endemic due to vaccine shortage? And we've actually addressed this tangentially, but it's a very direct question. Leading to rapid mutations, which the newer vaccines will have to chase. Do we get ahead anytime in the near future? So basically, this is where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I mean, this is honestly what I think I mentioned this earlier. This is my biggest concern, right? I mean, what we know about these mutations is they've emerged in countries with high levels of infection. So, Brazil, the UK, South Africa, and of course now India. India was almost inevitable, right? And we need to drive the transmission down to very low levels to reduce the chance of this happening, because it's not just the B117 that's increasingly just more infectious. It's the ones which are immune resistant are very problematic for us, and it means that we may have to restart and vaccinate everyone again a second time, right? And this is we're talking about the problems today. Can you imagine the problems of doing that? So I think this is a really big concern, and I think that's what I say, we need some kind of global coordination to figure out how do we do this. In fact, I would say the vaccines need to go to the countries who have the worst transmission. It's in everyone's global interest. The problem is it's not in national interest to do that, right? So, and it's not in national interest to do that because until countries can believe that there's an outcome at the end where we kill the virus at the end, everyone's just going to be protect themselves, and the rich countries will do that better than everyone else, right? So until we can make it feasible for people to say, yes, we can produce the vaccines which are effective against the new variants, and we can do it fast enough to essentially squash transmission, and then we'll be okay, because then we can go for elimination. I think we have a big problem, and I am worried about this, right? I mean, India, you can see what's going on. I mean, my estimate was, in Delhi, that previously you probably had 50, 60, 70% previous infection, right? And we know the real virus is better than most vaccines at protection, immune protection. And yet now we see what's going on in India. So, and we saw this in Brazil, in Manaus, where they had 70, 80% herd immunity, and then a new variant came along and things were even worse than the first wave. So we face a really serious problem, and I think people do not yet understand the gravity of the problem we face as a world, as a human race, and the cooperation that we need to fix it. Because it really is a problem. This is what I worry about.
Okay, thanks for that. Dway, I saw a question specifically for you, and IP-related question regarding Moderna. I'm trying to find it now. Now that Moderna has shared their IP, how will that impact vaccine production? How will that impact other this thing? Not compulsory licensing, but here you have so what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. First thing about Moderna, it did not come up with this again on its own. To echo Ravi's point, it's just a few streets away from me, so I've been able to track them for the last years. They have large sums of undisclosed DARPA fund, which is US Army funding. They've been funded by the US state and subsidized. So the Moderna vaccine is basically a taxpayer-based vaccine. They have not put in any money in the big picture. So what does it mean for them to license out IP in the first place? This is not their IP to begin with. This is the IP that has been developed thanks to US taxpayer money. Okay, that's a utopic picture. Now that there is this idea to license out IP, Moderna is not the only one. AstraZeneca is doing it. Nearly every big pharma companies said something to the version of they won't profit from this and licensing, and they will license it out. One, they have strict stipulations. The language is vague, so there's strict stipulations how long this licensing will last, if at all. They do not allow for technology transfers. So it doesn't entail a enlargement of production. And very simply, a license is, when it's coming from the point of view of the corporation, it limits what can be done with it very, very strongly. A license works when it's coming from the point of view of the demand, where you actually frame it in the ways that are needed in order for it to be made to circulate at scale. These are, again, I think, a very clear outcome of the last 20 decades of bad PR for pharma companies, where they were shamed in many ways. And so they've developed a really sophisticated strategy, which is to say that they will, quote unquote, license out their vaccines, except when it comes down to the ground, licensing does not really even come close to answering the question of global inequity.
Thank you. Okay, Shubhanga, so this is the poll that some of the audience took. And the questions were, have you been vaccinated? One dose, 44%, which is probably higher than the regional average, I would say. Second dose is 13%, which is definitely higher than the... so we're a privileged group of people here than the regional, not yet 50%. And what is interesting, and that brings us to the point which was made earlier, I don't trust COVID vaccines as 0%. Now, there could be two reasons for this. One is, in a group like this, it is self-selective. And number two, even if I'm a vaccine skeptic, listening to all these brilliant people on the panel, and, there's peer pressure and so on and so forth. So we need to take this with a slight pinch of salt, but I think it reflects the fact that trust or vaccine hesitancy doesn't seem to be an issue. Question is the stuff to us, right? Fund us or get vaccines to us, build the infrastructure, and it's okay. There are other questions, of course, in the issue of what vaccine, and the fact that the virus and the vaccine are in this sort of game of catch-up, and the virus is always quicker than the vaccine because it's not bounded by a particular point in time. So there are all of these issues as well. So I don't see, but I would like to bring in both Zaima and Ursula on this. I'm fascinated by the idea that both the eastern end of the region and the western end of the region are present. On once more, really looking, I guess, not so much from the ground, but from your particular sort of locations or situations and your own experiences, what is the way forward? If I were to interview you, Zaima, and say, okay, you're in Bangladesh, what is the way forward? You've seen all these problems. Do we do without a vaccine at all?
For a large part of last year, we were still banking on a very unscientific concept called herd immunity. We had actual politicians talking about herd immunity. We had journalists and policymakers debating about herd immunity. I mean, of course, this theory was completely debunked. But that sort of belief or sort of resignation towards herd immunity is definitely making a comeback in Bangladesh. I can assure you of that much, because when the vaccines, for example, when we first managed our first batch of vaccines, and we thought that we would be getting 3 crore vaccine doses from India, that was definitely an uplifting moment during this year when we thought that there was going to be an end to this. That no longer, the end line to this race is no longer very visible for people. For example, during this lockdown, it was very, very difficult to enforce this lockdown because the general public perception was that this is our new normal. People will die, unfortunately, and we just need to get used to it. Our hospitals will be overburdened. We will not be able to save everyone, and that's just the new reality. This lockdown particularly was very difficult. Businesses have been vehemently opposing this lockdown. Every single day, businesses have been protesting. Small businesses have been completely decimated. Small businesses, they're not even in the picture anymore. But large businesses now are coming forward, and they're also opposing the lockdown. We are considering the government is still on the hedge. It's still hinging on extending the lockdown, but we're not very sure what's going to happen. For example, the transport owners today held a meeting with the government, and they were like, "You need to start buses again. You need to start commuter vehicles again, because we're not going to be able to survive. Another lockdown. We're not going to be able to survive if you keep the economy closed." So when it comes to the way forward, there seems to be more of a resignation, as opposed to having like solution-based steps that we can take. We definitely don't have any solution-based steps at the moment.
That is tragic. Ursula, how about you? You had spoken earlier about the need for global cooperation, but I think sad but true, that's not going to happen tomorrow, and the virus is not going to wait for global cooperation to. So, from your position, what do you see? Is there anything you see that can be immediately done in terms of building public? I know, but in terms of public health.
Thank you. Following to earlier points that I have made in terms of global cooperation or regional cooperation, I think when it comes to address the issue of vaccine hesitancy, we should not wait for the regional and global cooperation to work and have results and then start campaigning. There has to be as much as possible at different levels awareness-raising campaigns that can give people accurate information. There's a lot of false information spreading around. Social media is unfortunately contributing to that one way or another. Some of this probably are not conspiracy, but disappeared in the middle of conspiracy. And that requires a very strong cooperation between health organizations, the state institutions dealing with health matters, and also civil society in our region, where there can be a joint collaborative action of continuously and systematically trying to raise awareness and prepare people. What is vaccination? Is this a cure? If not, is we say wiqaya, which is like prevention. So it's prevention in what way it operates. That's one way of helping. And speaking of lockdowns, there is also discussion as we speak in Kabul within the health sector about a possible round of 40 to 60 days of lockdown. And again, people are terrified because, I mean, we are not talking about countries where people can go under furloughs or, get payments and all that, like in the West, in other countries. For many people, sitting at home is not an option. Today, in the morning, there was an explosion in Jalalabad city, eastern Afghanistan, and one of my relatives, unfortunately, got injured in that incident. And when you have this conversation with her, she's a doctor, and when we have this conversation of, can you just, slow down and not go? And she said, what would I eat? What would my family eat if I stay home? So even violent attacks like suicide bombings or IEDs these days are quite common, or magnetic bombings are common. Even if these things cannot put people to sit at home and wait for the situation to get, calm, how can a virus do, really? Lockdowns are not solutions. And I think one problem, if we look back for the last year from the World Health Organization, that I can see is this issue of having like one package of solution addressing the whole in the same way. And it doesn't really work there. And we've seen that practice show that in this pandemic, that we have to have like concrete and find more creative solutions to contribute to prevention, as opposed to just declaration of general lockdowns. really probably more mass distribution of masks that can be mass information in terms of, hygienes and cleanliness is much effective than forcing people to sit at home and not do. Because also when it comes to space, we know that physical space matters. So highly concentrated areas could be, more restricted, but places with open areas could have more possibilities. So there can be more creative ways of looking into things rather than just simply ordering a lockdown and expecting it to have to be effective. Thank you.
Ravi, I think you want to come in on this. Ravi, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, lots of things that come up. I mean, just in terms of what I think of the future, I'm relatively pessimistic because I think we do have solutions, but they're very unlikely to happen at the current time. We need global cooperation. We need sensible action by lots of governments, even within their own countries. And that's the problem we face. And what we're going to face is not necessarily a bad outcome for Europe or North America. I think they will get on. They have enough money to keep the economies afloat. They will vaccinate. I think we're going to see exacerbation of the pre-existing global economic inequalities, and they're going to get worse, with the exception of the few emerging economies who got this right. Places like Vietnam, obviously China, right? Even China. So I think that's the thing that's going to happen. And why did this happen? I think that, if you look right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this debate about, do we kill this virus or do we live with it? Do we let the economy take precedence? And as you are all learning, letting the economy take precedence in the end backfired in a big way, right? The only countries who can protect their marginalized people are the countries with no virus, right? So this was not understood. And if you think about where I think the idea came from, I mean, it had a lot of intellectual backing. It came from the UK. The UK basically said, oh, we'll do lockdowns till we get a vaccine, right? And of course, when you do lockdowns in the UK or Europe, you can put money into people's pockets. You can keep, the zombie companies continue to operate because, the state will pay for it. We can't do that in Sri Lanka. We don't have money to do that. And yet that idea, I think, took hold of the imagination. And, Dway, I think, deals with the epistemology of ideas. It took it embraced the imagination of leaders everywhere else. And so we've tried to live with this and prioritize the economy. How we turn that back, I don't know. Now, for Sri Lanka, I still hope, and I think we still have a little window of opportunity to basically, even without the vaccine, get back to zero. It will need a lot of effort in doing the right things, which we're not at the moment, but it's feasible for us. We have the infrastructure. I don't know what countries like India and Bangladesh, most of Africa, Latin America do, where you've had widespread transmission, right? You've probably had 30-40% of your population infected, and you don't have the public health infrastructure, and you don't have the vaccine. I really don't know what the solution is to that, because the problem with this virus is unless you get it to zero, it will just keep on coming back every 2 or 3 months. I mean, India has just learned this at a huge cost. So I don't know. I really don't know what we say unless, as I said, the only way out is that moonshot where we get true, genuine global cooperation to produce the supplies and everything else we need to do this, and a rethink on the global strategy.
And I'd just like to add to that it's not as if we're testing either. Our testing numbers have, I mean, of course it's improved, but we still have abysmally low testing ratios per million population. So we still don't know what the actual scenario of infection is like. And this is something we were talking about before the webinar started, is that Shubhanga was mentioning that, the infection rate has gone down. Yes, the infection rate is actually below 10% for the first time in a month. The daily infection rate is below 10% for the first time in a month. But most of us are very skeptic about it, and we're taking it with a grain of salt because when it comes to, we're not very sure how related that is to people being unwilling to test, people being unable to test because of the lockdown. These are such hazy concepts for us right now that we don't necessarily know what how much of our population was even infected to begin with.
I'm going to throw a couple of examples at you, both of rich countries that have very low rates of vaccination so far. And I'm taking China out of the equation because they went for an elimination strategy, squash the virus whenever you see it, take that out. Japan has got, I think, basically South Asian levels of immunization, right? But their cases are small. You have countries like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, bordering China, and therefore, ipso fact, they've been vulnerable since, this virus thing. Very low. Thailand has got very good public health infrastructure. They've got the experience of HIV/AIDS. So there's some answer for, they have. But we do have examples of poor countries without the greatest infrastructure in the world managing to keep transmission and rates of, of both cases and I guess infections low, transmission low as well. And I guess they seem to have done it without vaccination, but with basically really old-fashioned things. Well, one, of course, is contact tracing, isolation, anything to prevent a virus going from person A to person B, right? Do you think this is possible? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the social discipline? I don't know, but discipline is an awful word to use. But do we have the will to do this? Can we mobilize ordinary people? Instead of us having this conversation, can people out on the streets, the people working in garment factories in Bangladesh, the people who living in slums in India, could we get them to have this conversation? And these are just ideas that I'm throwing out, but these are the sort of ideas I think we need, because if we're going to wait for vaccines, this great savior that's going to descend from the skies, I think we'll be waiting a long term. So this is just thoughts off the top, well, not off the top of my head, things I've been thinking about for a long time. So I throw that to Ravi. Sorry, your hand is up.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, we at our institute, we published a paper a few months ago in Health Affairs, and we showed that in fact, from the first wave, the most important intervention was testing. Right, lockdowns in most developing countries were pretty useless. I mean, India knows this. They had a lockdown, and it just kept on spreading. So I think testing is absolutely critical. I'm actually also a global citizen. I'm currently now in Sydney. Sydney is also pretty slow on vaccination. We've been told people in our age group would get vaccinated till the end of the year at this point. They're in no rush. They've dropped AstraZeneca now because it's too dangerous for them. And they're in no big rush. They're going to go with Pfizer. And the reason is they test. Testing, tracing, and isolation, as long as you've closed your borders, works. That, if you look at South Asia, you didn't mention the obvious success story in South Asia. It's not Sri Lanka. It's Bhutan. Bhutan is free of virus, right? They had the highest testing rates in South Asia, right? If you look at Southeast Asia, nobody would think Cambodia would have got this. I mean, Cambodia is, it's a pretty dysfunctional society, but they got it because they tested, right? Vietnam tested, Australia tested, New Zealand tested, China tested. The Japanese actually aren't doing that well at the moment. They're probably going to lose the Olympics. That's not the country they're going because they didn't test enough. And it's a bit like Sri Lanka. We did reasonably well in the first wave. We have good tracing capacity, public health infrastructure, but the public health people in Sri Lanka, and I think the public health people in Japan, did not accept the importance of testing. And I think this reflects a cultural problem in the medical community. Public health people are very averse to medical interventions, and testing is sort of, you put things down people's throats and send them off to lab. It's very medical. There's some averseness, I think, to doing testing, certainly in Sri Lanka in general, before COVID, and a reluctance to invest in it. I can tell you that our ministry was offered testing machines and we turned them down earlier in the pandemic. This is the incredible mistakes they made, but this was repeated across the world. So I think, yes, we can do this, but the only way that countries have got to zero so far has not been vaccines. It's been very aggressive testing, tracing, and isolation, and that's across the world. Wuhan did it. Remember, forgotten about Wuhan. People are dying, right, left, right, and center. and now it's forgotten. But Wuhan eventually beat it through testing. It wasn't the lockdown. I mean, all the research indicates it was the testing and isolation of people in the households and pulling them out and putting them into institutional quarantine that actually did it for them. The lockdown wasn't good enough to get the transmission down to where it would stop.
Okay, go ahead. I'm going to call you.
I'd just like to add to that, that the testing costs in Bangladesh are still very, very prohibitively expensive. So, for example, an on-demand test, if you're going to be, there are two, you can get tested in 2 ways. You can either go to a public or government facility and get tested for free. That's not going to cost you anything, I think. Or you could get an on-demand test at a private facility. And private facility would cost you nearly about $50. So $50 for a test, that's like half the minimum wage of the monthly minimum wage that a garment worker earns. A garment worker is not going to be able to access an on-demand test. And when it comes to the government facilities, a year has gone by, but it's the same scenario every single morning. They'll be lining up from like 3 a.m. in the morning because most hospitals can only do only have enough PCR machines to do about like 200 to 300 tests. And so you have people lining up from like 3 or 4 in the morning, hoping that they can be the first one in through the door when the doors open at 9 a.m. And that scenario still hasn't changed. We've been following this pretty solidly at the Daily Star. Every single day we've published photos of people fainting, like lying unconscious on the sidewalk because they've been standing on the sidewalk waiting for a test since like 5 a.m. and then they just like lost consciousness. But it seems as if those concerns are still falling on deaf ears, and of course with that being the scenario, I'm not sure the testing is going to get any better. It seems as if this is something that we did talk about last year, but here too, it seems as if this has been talked about so much, no one's talking about it anymore.
Yeah.
May I just add on the testing part? So I think we're also not entirely different from other parts. There are testing facilities more than before, obviously, but then if you look into the official numbers, approximately 400,000 plus are tested so far. So in a country of over 30 million population, that's just nothing. I personally, traveling, moving from one lockdown to another in the last year, I count like at least I tested myself 3-4 times. 1 or 2 out of not feeling well, and another 2 because I needed to travel. So pre-traveling test. Well, actually 6 times. I had another 2 tests. So we know that people with privileges, with facilities, have access to it. Ordinary people doesn't. And because of the stigma involved in this, stigma is economic purely, but also socio-cultural, I would say. People avoid testing. And we just, to get a sense of numbers in Afghanistan, I don't know how this is in other parts of South Asia, we just multiply everything into 6 or 8 when it comes to testing. So if a single individual is tested positive, we assume that the entire household is hit. And the household average is 6 to 8, minimum. It is just, husband, wife, and children. But we know that our families are living in much extended families. So and they are, generally, like, it's impossible to really respect the social distancing, and congregations on different occasions, from funeral to wedding ceremonies to, for example, prayers nowadays that we are observing Ramadan, a holy month. I heard, in the mosque, the mullah was saying to some relatives that, okay, now the pandemic situation is calmed down, so don't forget to come to Taraweeh. Taraweeh is this collective, prayers in the evenings. Luckily, one good thing that happened, I saw that yesterday or day before yesterday, there were news about religious scholars or religious leaders or heads of the mosques given also a priority for the vaccination, for the sole purpose of trying to work on the awareness. I think this is a very positive aspect that we've sort of practiced. I saw, at least in the news, that there was a piece about one of the religious community members talking to the public and saying that it's important to do vaccination because they're also at the end, it also becomes a religious issue. Is this a halal vaccination or not? And so one has to really cover all these matters for health purposes and also for ensuring that people earn the trust. So testing facilities, I think, and I fully agree. Earlier on, I remember, I think Singapore was one of those role models at the very early stages of this situation, where they managed so well with the testing. So at that time, we didn't have the facilities. Now, I think the same way the vaccine productions are discussed, I believe there should be also discussions about availability of testings, because that is, if not the same, equally important in terms of ensuring that mobility is controlled, that we have. But I think still we are probably far away from it being enough for people, really. Thank you.
Shubhanga, I'd like to.
Yeah.
If you have anything from, I've lost my chat thing for some reason. So
yeah, no.
Do you have anything for questions?
Yes.
And also the result of the poll that you conducted on
yes,
private versus public provision of vaccine.
Yeah, I think we might come to the results of the poll towards the end. I mean, since we're talking about inequality and segregation in access, I had a question, and maybe we can begin with Dway Banerjee, also given his work on how the urban poor in Delhi kind of negotiated the failing healthcare system, and you write about how that's the latest in a series of failures, and we're seeing devastating scenes from India. I mean, how do we what kind of implication and what kind of from a social scientific point of view, how do we think about the impact of what's happening in terms of the social fabric, what happens to communities? I mean, it must leave an imprint. And what kind of, as a social scientist, how do we think about the changes in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
That's a great question. So I'll say that, let me put it in this way. I don't think right now there is a crisis. I don't want to underplay the extent of the crisis. It is unprecedented, but I will still say that the problem is not COVID-19 and the solution are not vaccines. The problem, the problem and the solution is infrastructure. That is what is unfortunately and inescapably the only way out of this. Why do I say this? Because COVID-19 will become endemic, like all viruses do in certain ways. And the question is, what do we do? How do we manage this process? Because we'll not be getting to herd immunity perhaps at any point, but we'll get to this way in which it becomes a manageable virus that you vaccinate every year on. So how do we deal with something that is on the way to becoming endemic? And what do we do when the next pandemic comes? We had Ebola not too far back. We also forget the many plagues and outbreaks and epidemics that happen on a yearly basis in India. For example, in 1996 there was a plague outbreak in Gujarat. And there've been, every year we have small episodes of this. Just because it's not a big global problem, we don't address or talk about it. So all this to say that this is not the last time we're going to face a problem like this. Maybe it'll be at different scales, maybe it'll be different proportions. But the way out is to prepare ourselves in ways that things like contact tracing, things like delivery systems are put in place. And the Indian government has been in its entire post-colonial period, culpable in why COVID-19 has been so disastrous. We spend amongst the least in healthcare infrastructure in any country in the world, in the bottom 20 nearly always. So if that is the case, I think the problem is that, and not the many pandemics and epidemics that will continuously break out. We need to fix the basic public health failures that are not new at all to people who are experiencing disease.
Okay, just to open the question to others also. I mean, we're also curious what the role of, when we talk about health infrastructure, I think there's a lot of, the imagination is that of the state or public health infrastructure. But we also know last 20, 30 years has been this massive rise in the private industry in healthcare sector, around South Asia. So, I mean, I'm curious, what is the scene like in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Afghanistan, and what has been the role of private players, and how is the public sphere kind of, is there a critique of the private player? Are they seen as saviors at a time when the public sector isn't there? I mean, and there is debate on their position and what might have led to kind of economic changes and state involvement. So yeah, please, maybe we might start with Ravi. You.
Yes, I just asked that and also just comment on the previous comments. I mean, I think, sadly, of course, we need better health infrastructure everywhere. But, this is a long-term process and it's not going to be, frankly, I'm not sure it's going to be accelerated that much by this pandemic. I mean, this is a long-term social issue for most countries, universal healthcare. Let's be realistic. That's going to take a long time. But then I would also point out, remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this index, the Global Health Security Index, and then there was another one called the Disease Vulnerability Index, both produced in the United States by defense analysts. And they rank countries by infrastructure and capability. It was completely wrong. The countries that were supposedly had the best infrastructure, the most preparedness, the United States and the UK did the worst, right? So this, in case of COVID-19, this was not really an infrastructure problem. It was a problem of basically, could you do the basic public health stuff, which we've known for 100 years, and do it well? And were you willing to make those decisions, right? And that's more a political problem, right? You can have a lot of infrastructure, but still mess up. And you can have no infrastructure like Cambodia and still get it right. So, I think that's the issue of pandemic and health access is a bit different. I think in terms of moving forward, what will happen next time, I don't know. And I think it really depends. I mean, it's shown us the difficulties of solving these complex problems at the country level as well as the global level. I don't know whether countries, they may be more willing to act next time because, like countries which had SARS, I mean, Thomas, I think, lived in Hong Kong, presumably during the SARS epidemic. People were a bit more aware, okay, we have to do something serious about this kind of problem. So maybe that will linger, but I don't know. I think we need to be realistic that we need to figure out what went wrong in the policy process, even at the country level. Right? But for Sri Lanka, now is not the time, but we will eventually have to ask, why did we, with all our resources as a country, health resources, get it wrong, mess up? And I think there needs to be, an independent, review that in each country, and there needs to be an independent global review. And we need to, once we get over the current, hysteria, and right now we can't talk about China properly because people have all sorts of views about that in the United States, but we need to have a rethink about policy process.
Maybe Zaima. Again,
Could
on
I quickly respond to that if that's okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But when I mean infrastructure, I don't mean, I think infrastructure in a very political sense. So I saw someone in the audience actually who's written a book called The Pandemic Perhaps, which is how pandemic preparedness became $1 billion industry over the last 20 years. These reports are an outcome of a massively funded approach to quote unquote being prepared. But the form of preparedness is what matters. It wasn't about bolstering public health, basic public health systems. It was about these very top-down technical interventions that were high cost, non-scalable. So that's why these indexes are completely off the mark. They index something that is not actually on the ground. So I absolutely agree. It's about the infrastructure by itself is not what's at stake, but the political ways in which we define what infrastructure is what at stake.
I think we probably agree on that. It's a softer thing. It's not the infrastructure is a bad misleading term.
Maybe Zaima and then Orzala, just on the the public-private divide and how that might have impacted what we're seeing now with pandemic response, but also vaccination and what might happen in the future.
So I'd like to talk about the pandemic response, the public-private divide between when it comes to the pandemic response. So for a large part of the year last year, the private sector was not actually they just didn't step up. We have we have we do have a large number of private hospitals. It's not as if the private hospitals or the private healthcare industry isn't a good thriving business. It is. Almost every single large industrial group that's out there, they have massive hospitals. But what we didn't see is them stepping up and actually doing the remodeling, the retrofitting needed to provide a pandemic response as fast as they could, or as soon as they could last year. They did not. So the public hospitals, unfortunately, I think there were like 5 only at to begin with, were the first ones which had to start taking in COVID-19 patients. They soon caught up. The private sector definitely soon caught up, and they did open their doors. But right now, the costs are absolutely astronomical. The out-of-pocket payment is can go up to for an ICU bed in a private hospital can go up to like 1 lakh every single day. So a lakh taka, that would be around. Give me just a second. Let me quickly compute this. Yeah, that would be around like $1,100 every single day. That is not something that private healthcare, although it is right now available, that is not something that most of our population can afford. So it seems like there is definitely a gap of information as well regarding what happens to people who are not being able to afford this healthcare. Because right now what we're seeing is a crisis of the rich. People who can afford healthcare, or people who can perhaps access this a large amount of money on credit to afford the healthcare, and then we're seeing their crisis. We have no idea what's actually happening to people who can't even dream of a hospital bed or an ICU bed in a private hospital setting. And as for the public hospitals, even, for example, we've been visiting hospitals every other day, and what we've seen is that because of an oxygen and a bed crisis, you can perhaps get a space on the floor, or you can get like a metal a trolley to land your back on, but if you need an oxygen cylinder, that's something that you're going to have to get yourself. If for example the hospital is not equipped with a central oxygen supply, which a lot of hospitals aren't. They don't have, a lot of them don't have central oxygen plants. So then once again, you're having, even if you do go to even if you do go to the public healthcare system, you're still having to pay out of pocket and pay really large amounts of money out of pocket. Medication is once again, when it comes to the medication, right now the 2 most prescribed medication are remdesivir and Actemra. So remdesivir is, I forget how much it costs, but Actemra is $45,000 for every single. Sorry, 45,000 taka for every single dose. That's around $500. So these are not medications that our general population can access. Right now, probably the least expensive option is plasma donation, and that has many. I'm not sure that, for example, when it came to South African and the Brazil varieties, scientific studies have shown that plasma antibodies or recovering plasma doesn't necessarily have as much of an actual effect or neutralizing effect on these varieties. Because they're just not the same strain. So we are definitely at a stage where our private healthcare system is benefiting, but not necessarily benefiting in the guise of trying to provide public service, but they're definitely not providing a public service.
Yeah, I have just one quick comment on both. I mean, the most expensive drugs, and I won't know why this is. Once more, I think it is to do with the pharmaceutical. Remdesivir is pretty much useless. At best, it's been found to reduce hospital stay by 4 to 5 days when given to mild to moderate patients at the right time. But now it's universally prescribed, as in Bangladesh. There's this huge black market. Plasma is not very helpful either, right? And this is what clinical trials have found. In terms of treatment, basically we need oxygen and you need steroids basically prevent your lungs. But these are the two that 99% of cases, 95, 90 probably without even oxygen, but the remaining, that's all you need. But this is the subject for another discussion. How did all these drugs, right, which are in short supply, of limited utility, suddenly become gold? I can understand why vaccines are in short supply, but at least they work. These don't. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, clinicians were basically throwing whatever they could. And you can't blame them for that. Over the last year, clinical trials, randomized trials have been held. We've got pretty strong results, and these results all show that it doesn't really help that much, except in very specific issues. So how did that happen? Anyway, Shubhanga, how are we for time?
I think we're pretty close to the end. I just wanted to hear if Orzala had any perspective
Yes.
on this public-private divide quickly. And the scene of individual family members carrying oxygen tanks in India, which seems like a terrible future possibility for other countries in the region. So just to get a sense of what's that like in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Shubhanga. In terms of the private sector's role, just before that, what Thomas was mentioning in terms of that, I wanted to also add that in Afghanistan, it became the same case. One relative I knew that he was going through one of those really intensive care for like months. The family would buy some injections. Now, I don't know really what the names of those injections was, up to something called 6,000 AFs, which is approximately 70 to 80 US dollars per injection. So they would find it in somewhere in the pharmacies in Kabul city. And he needed one of these injections at least a day. For a very intense period. Now, like, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know exactly what that was, but I can say that the pharmaceutical industry have really exploited this situation, and there hasn't been any regulations to control that a simple medication should not suddenly go rise like the price of oil or gas goes up in winters. It just was the same kind of reaction you could see. Private sector is also involved in the testing process, and unfortunately, that also doesn't have a very controlled price. So you can do the same tests with different prices in different places, and I think that's not unique to our region or probably Afghanistan or India and so forth. I can see that also even in the UK, that's the case. So you can do the same PCR test with different prices. Sometimes there is a difference in terms of timing, but other times with the same time, but different offers. So I don't know how free economy, sort of like market economy or not control over prices is contributing to that. And in terms of, the oxygen's availability or the facilities and infrastructures, one quick point that we have seen in Afghanistan, particularly in the initial stages, it also got parallel to the sort of political events that are happening and evolving as well. At one point, they suddenly start building hospitals, copying some kind of a Chinese model of having a massive hospital being built. And there was massive reaction to that and say that, look, we don't need physical infrastructures for this. What we need is like making available a mosque in a village so that you can do the self-isolation. There are quarantines there. So we have been in contact with government trying to communicate these messages and say, don't waste your time. Okay, fine. If places require a hospital, build them a hospital, but you don't need to make that connected to the COVID, because COVID does not need entirely that level of infrastructure. On the other hand, when it comes to ventilator machines, thanks to our generous, sponsors and supporters from the world, we received ventilator machines. But guess what? Nobody knew how to use it. In many, many cases, ventilator machines ended up in Peshawar markets or, neighboring countries, sold in the black market because A, there is issues of inaccountability and corruption, and B, there was also issue of lack of capability of being able to use it. On the other side, the basic oxygen price, also similar to other things that we mentioned, rised up in the times of higher needs, and it's predictable that the same thing will happen Now, there isn't any very accurate data whether we have enough oxygens if we are going towards the third wave. Are we ready for it? And what are the kind of requirements that we could have in terms of medical supply for the intensive cares, oxygens, ventilator machines? Have we provided in this phase any kind of facilities or any kind of trainings for medical workers in terms of using the advanced ventilator machines? I don't have any specific data, I'm afraid, but my very distant observation is that probably we don't, as all those things requires quite a long procedure to really materialize in a time that I don't think anyone really worked on it more seriously.
Thank you. I think, Thomas, we've gone 5 minutes beyond the scheduled time, so I'll take that as a good sign of a very engaging and interesting conversation. Do you have any final words?
Not really. I think this is something that maybe we could all take away, and we will get through this pandemic. The question really is that this is an event that is going to change the world. All previous, whether it's 1918, whether it's been the outbreaks of plague that we saw in the 18th and 19th, they've had significant political, economic, and social changes because you're ripping apart the existing fabric of the world. And I think for us really to think about is really what kind of a post-pandemic world we want. And how do we go about building it right now? Right? How do we use the space that now exists, that the space that this crisis has created, to build something better? And I think that is the only way that, we can sort of sustain our own, in the midst of our own despair. And I think all of our Twitter feeds are full of people asking for oxygen, right? Yeah. ICU beds. And I think this is something we've all, and stories of somebody's father who died waiting for a bed outside a hospital, and so on and so forth. And we're not even directly suffering. I mean, you have somebody, your family. But for all of us, it's everybody, it's stressful. And the only way really to make sense of all of this is really to try and find space to create something better at the end of this. And that's the only thought that...
Yeah, no, I think that's a good note to end on. And I want to thank everyone, all the speakers, and Thomas for a very rich and wide-ranging discussion. I also want to thank our audience, both on Zoom and Facebook Live, and for their questions and for their time. And also want to remind at the end that you can support Himal's work by being a member. You just go to our website, and you'll also get a free copy of our right side of map delivered to you. So keep following our work, and thank you everyone for making this a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Lovely meeting all of you. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah,
stay safe.
Yes. Yes.
Bye-bye.